Germany assembled the largest invasion force in human history and gave it 90 days to win a war against the largest country on Earth. This is the story of five compounding mistakes that turned the most confident military gamble of the 20th century into the beginning of the end for the regime that launched it. A campaign that came closer than any single military operation before or since to eliminating a great power in one continuous summer of fighting, and a campaign whose eventual failure would shape the outcome of the entire rest of the Second World War far more decisively than any single battle fought on any other front, in any other theatre, for the remainder of that same conflict. On June the 22nd, 1941, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, supported by more than 3,000 tanks and nearly 3,000 aircraft, organized into a force whose sheer physical scale had never been assembled by any single country before in the entire history of warfare. It remains, to this day, the largest land invasion ever launched by one country against another, dwarfing every comparable operation in either World War and every invasion attempted in the 80 years since. Within hours, more than 2,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them still parked on the ground exactly where German reconnaissance photographs had shown them sitting in the preceding weeks. An entire air force effectively eliminated before most of its own pilots had finished their morning coffee. Within days, German panzer spearheads had driven more than 100 miles into Soviet territory, advancing at a pace that outstripped even the most optimistic pre-war planning estimates. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, had been encircled and captured in a series of battles that shattered the Western Soviet military almost entirely, leaving whole sections of the front with functionally no organized defense left standing in front of the advancing Germans at all. A collapse so sudden and so total across such a wide stretch of territory that some German staff officers privately began revising their own 90-day estimate downward rather than upward, wondering whether the campaign might in fact finish even faster than Hitler himself had originally promised his generals it would. Adolf Hitler believed and told his own generals directly and repeatedly that the campaign would be finished in roughly 90 days, before the harvest came in and long before any Russian winter could possibly become a factor worth planning around in any serious way. It was not finished in 90 days. It was not finished in any meaningful sense, ever, before the army that launched it had been destroyed defending the same capital city it had once expected to capture before the first snow fell that same year. Mistake number one. German intelligence catastrophically underestimated the actual depth of Soviet manpower and industrial capacity, a miscalculation that shaped nearly every other decision the campaign's planners made from the very beginning. Pre-war German planning assumed the Soviet Union could field somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 divisions in total, a number German intelligence believed represented the full available strength of the Soviet military system once mobilized, a figure that senior planners treated as close to a hard ceiling rather than a rough starting estimate. The real figure was closer to 600, with fresh divisions raised, equipped, and thrown into the fighting faster than German intelligence had believed the Soviet industrial and administrative system was capable of producing them at all. An entire hidden Second Army, effectively invisible to pre-war German reconnaissance and analysis. German commanders spoke openly, in the campaign's opening weeks, of the Soviet Union as a rotten structure that would collapse the moment its outer wall was breached, a phrase that captured exactly how confidently German planners expected total collapse rather than sustained resistance stretching across years rather than weeks. The wall kept producing more soldiers behind it, week after week, long after German intelligence estimates had assumed there would be nothing left to produce them with. Entire freshly raised armies appearing on German maps in places pre-war planning had confidently marked as already exhausted, a pattern that would repeat itself, with only minor variation, for the remaining 4 years of fighting on the same front. Mistake number two. The invasion's own scale became a logistics problem no army in history had ever actually solved at anywhere near this size. A mismatch between ambition and infrastructure that grew worse the further the army advanced, and that no amount of tactical skill on the battlefield could fully compensate for. 3 million men, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and more than 600,000 horses required fuel, ammunition, and food delivered across supply lines that grew longer by the day as German spearheads advanced deeper into Soviet territory than any pre-war plan had comfortably accounted for. Some units eventually operating hundreds of miles ahead of their own nearest functioning supply depot. Soviet railways used a different gauge than German railways, forcing engineers to convert captured track by hand, mile by mile, behind an advance that was moving faster than that conversion work could possibly keep pace with, leaving supplies stacking up at conversion points far behind the front rather than reaching the units that actually needed them most urgently. A significant share of German logistics still depended on horse-drawn transport in 1941. In an army that presented itself to the world and largely believed of itself as the most fully mechanized fighting force ever assembled. A quiet contradiction between the army's own self-image and the actual wagons and draft animals hauling much of its supply forward. The tanks could advance considerably faster than the fuel meant to keep them moving, and more than once that summer, entire panzer divisions sat still for days at a time. Not because of enemy resistance in front of them, but because the fuel trucks meant to reach them simply had not arrived yet. Victories won on the battlefield sitting unexploited because the army that won them had nothing left in its tanks to press the advantage further. Mistake number 3. In August of 1941, with German forces still advancing and Moscow within apparent reach after 2 months of nearly uninterrupted success, Hitler diverted the campaign's main armoured strength away from the capital entirely, overruling his own senior field commanders in the process, despite their direct and repeated objections. Führer Directive 33 ordered Army Group Center onto the defensive and sent its panzer groups south toward Kiev and north toward Leningrad instead, prioritizing Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources and a series of further encirclement battles over the single most direct route to ending the war quickly, while Soviet defenses in front of Moscow itself remained comparatively thin. The diversion produced a genuine triumph. The encirclement of Kiev that September, capturing roughly 665,000 Soviet prisoners, the worst single defeat the Soviet Union suffered in the entire war, and a battlefield success German propaganda celebrated at considerable length in newsreels shown across the country. It also cost Army Group Center more than 2 irreplaceable months of good campaigning weather it did not have to spare, delaying the resumed drive on Moscow until the calendar had turned decisively, and as it turned out fatally, against it, a trade of strategic time for tactical prisoners that would only reveal its true cost months later. Mistake number 4. German forces entered a Russian winter with no meaningful preparation for one, an oversight that cost the campaign dearly at the exact moment it could least afford further losses of any kind. Engine oil thickened into an unusable paste overnight in temperatures German equipment had never been designed to operate in, and machine guns required soldiers to urinate on frozen bolts simply to free them enough to fire. Weapons froze solid in soldiers' hands, rifle actions seizing shut at ranges where a working weapon meant the difference between holding a position and losing it to a counterattack. Vehicles required hours of preheating before they could move at all. Time an army under counterattack rarely had to spare when the enemy was already closing in from multiple directions at once. German quartermasters had planned for a campaign that would be finished well before winter arrived, and when that plan failed, no comparable stockpile of winter clothing or cold weather equipment existed anywhere close to the front to replace what the army now urgently needed, and simply did not have in anything like sufficient quantity. Soldiers advancing on Moscow in October found themselves, by December, fighting in improvised layers of looted civilian clothing, sweaters and coats taken from abandoned homes, against an enemy dressed and equipped for exactly the weather German planners had assumed, back in the optimistic spring of that same year, would never actually matter to the outcome of the campaign at all. Mistake number 5. Soviet resistance did not collapse the way German intelligence had confidently predicted, and it stiffened at the exact moment German strength was thinnest and most exhausted after months of continuous, uninterrupted fighting. Soviet military intelligence, through a spy embedded inside the German embassy in Tokyo, confirmed in the autumn of 1941 that Japan had no intention of attacking the Soviet Union from the east, information Stalin trusted enough to act on decisively, even after ignoring dozens of earlier warnings about the invasion itself just months before that same year. That confirmation allowed the Soviet High Command to transfer battle-hardened divisions from Siberia to the Moscow front. Fresh, properly equipped soldiers, accustomed to genuinely cold conditions, arriving in large numbers, at the exact moment German troops outside the city were exhausted, frozen, and stretched to their absolute logistical limit after months of continuous fighting across thousands of miles of hostile territory. On December the 5th, 1941, those reinforced Soviet forces launched a major counteroffensive that the German army besieging Moscow, worn down by every one of the 4 previous mistakes combined, had no remaining capacity to absorb or meaningfully resist. The opening weeks of the campaign gave German planners every reason to believe their 90-day estimate was not just optimistic but conservative. And it is worth understanding exactly how convincing that early evidence actually was before judging the confidence it produced too harshly in hindsight. The Battle of Bialystok-Minsk, fought in the campaign's first 2.5 weeks, encircled and destroyed enormous Soviet forces before the war had even reached its first month. A catastrophe for the Red Army that set the pattern for the still larger encirclement battles that followed at Smolensk shortly afterward. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed in engagements that seemed, at the time, to be proving every pre-war assumption about Soviet weakness entirely correct. German war correspondents filed reports describing an army on the verge of total collapse, and few observers on either side of the front, in those first weeks, had any serious reason to doubt them, since the visible evidence on the ground. Burning columns of Soviet vehicles, endless lines of prisoners marched westward under guard. Entire abandoned airfields, still smoking from the opening morning strikes, seemed to confirm every pre-war assumption in vivid, photographable detail that needed no further interpretation. It is precisely because those opening weeks went so completely according to plan that the 5 mistakes which followed did not register at the time as mistakes at all. Each one looked, in isolation and in the moment it was actually made, like a reasonable decision taken by confident commanders riding an unbroken string of genuine victories. What went wrong? Let's set the 5 mistakes side by side before looking at how they actually fed into each other, because summarized together, they reveal a pattern that no single battlefield report from that summer could have shown on its own. Mistake 1. German intelligence underestimated Soviet manpower and industrial depth so badly that an army believed to be finite kept producing fresh divisions faster than it could be destroyed. Mistake 2. An invasion force of 3 million men and 600,000 horses outran its own supply lines almost from the first week on railways that did not even match the German rail gauge. Mistake 3. Hitler diverted the campaign's main armoured strength away from Moscow toward Kiev in August, trading 2 irreplaceable months of good weather for a genuine but strategically costly victory. Mistake 4. German forces entered a Russian winter with no meaningful cold weather preparation, freezing engines and rifles alike at the exact moment the campaign most needed to keep moving. Mistake 5. Soviet resistance stiffened rather than collapsed, reinforced by fresh Siberian divisions, released the moment Stalin's own intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the east. The compounding failure eventually claimed the careers of the men who had led the campaign's early triumphs just as thoroughly as it claimed the campaign's own original timetable. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding the largest of the 3 army groups and the one tasked with capturing Moscow itself, was relieved of command in December of 1941. one of several senior generals dismissed in the weeks following the failure outside the capital, as Hitler searched for officers to hold personally responsible for a strategic outcome. His own July directives had done more than almost anything else to produce in the first place. General Heinz Guderian, whose panzer group had been diverted south to Kiev and then rushed back east for the final push on Moscow, was relieved of his own command that same December, a frustrated Hitler looking for someone closer to the front to blame than the strategic decisions made from headquarters months earlier. The pattern repeated itself across the officer corps that winter. Experienced commanders who had delivered exactly the encirclements and prison accounts German planning had asked of them, dismissed in turn once the campaign's actual timetable collapsed for reasons that had far more to do with decisions made in East Prussia than with any failure of leadership on the battlefield itself. These 5 mistakes did not happen in isolation from each other, and understanding how they fed into one another matters more than treating any single one as the decisive cause on its own, since no single mistake by itself would likely have proven fatal to the entire campaign. The underestimate of Soviet manpower made the Kiev diversion look, in the moment, like a reasonable gamble rather than a dangerous one, since German planners genuinely believed there was no deep reserve of Soviet strength left to worry about, regardless of which direction the panzers turned that August. Making a 2-month detour feel like a calculated risk rather than the irreversible loss of time it actually turned out to be. The logistics crisis made the diversion's cost in lost time far more expensive than it needed to be, since an army already struggling to supply itself along one axis of advance could not simply absorb months of redirected movement without falling further behind on every front at once. The fuel and ammunition that should have supported a direct drive on Moscow instead spread thin across 2 separate campaigns hundreds of miles apart from each other. The winter unpreparedness turned an already delayed offensive into an outright catastrophe, since German forces arriving at Moscow's outskirts in December rather than October met exactly the season their own planning had assumed would never actually matter. A season that would have been far less dangerous to an army that had reached the same positions 2 months earlier as originally intended and planned for. And the underestimated depth of Soviet resistance, reinforced by intelligence Stalin finally chose to believe after ignoring nearly everything else that year, arrived precisely when German strength had been worn down by the other 4 mistakes combined, rather than at some earlier, more survivable point in the campaign when a fresh, well-supplied German army might conceivably have absorbed the blow and continued advancing regardless. A single pattern connects all 5 mistakes more directly than any of them connect to simple bad luck or unforeseeable circumstance beyond anyone's reasonable control. Each one reflected a strategic culture built around Hitler's own personal confidence, overriding the more cautious, more methodical assessments of the professional soldiers actually responsible for planning and executing the campaign on the ground. Men who, in several documented instances, raised precisely the objections that later proved correct, and were overruled anyway by a single civilian leader whose military judgment had, up to that point in the war, been vindicated often enough that few of his own generals felt able to challenge it as forcefully as the moment actually required of them. That same pattern of overridden professional caution would recur, in different forms, at Stalingrad the following year, at Kursk the year after that, and in the Ardennes years later still. But its first and in some ways most consequential appearance came in the summer and autumn of 1941. In the 5 decisions that turned Europe's largest invasion force from history's closest attempt at eliminating a great power in a single campaign into the operation that, more than any other single decision of the entire war, ultimately guaranteed Germany would eventually lose it regardless of anything achieved on any other front afterward. Historians have debated for 80 years whether Operation Barbarossa could have succeeded under different decisions. A faster drive on Moscow in August rather than a diversion to Kiev. Better winter preparation planned months in advance and stockpiled well before the campaign began. A more honest pre-war assessment of Soviet reserves before the invasion was ever launched at all, rather than after the fighting had already exposed how wrong those assessments were. What is not seriously disputed is the outcome that actually followed on the ground, an outcome recorded in casualty rolls, supply reports, and prison accounts, rather than in any single contested historical judgment. German casualties in the first 6 months of the campaign exceeded 750,000 men, a toll the German army's replacement system could not sustain across a war that would now, thanks to the campaign's failure to end quickly, continue for nearly 4 more years on the same Eastern Front, consuming manpower and material at a rate the original 90-day plan had never once budgeted for or even seriously considered as a realistic possibility worth preparing against. The Soviet Union, battered and reeling as it clearly was by the end of 1941, having lost millions of soldiers killed or captured and vast stretches of its own most productive territory, including some of its richest agricultural land and most valuable industrial regions, had not collapsed, had not sought peace on any terms whatsoever, and had not stopped producing new divisions faster than German intelligence had ever believed possible in the first place. The same underestimated depth of manpower from mistake number one continuing to reassert itself for years after the invasion's opening weeks had already passed into history. The invasion that came closer than any other military operation in history to eliminating a great power in a single campaign ended instead as the moment the war quietly, irreversibly turned against the country that had launched it with such total confidence that June morning, a turn few observers on either side fully recognized as decisive, until years of subsequent fighting had made the pattern impossible to ignore any longer. Germany would go on fighting in the East for nearly 4 more years, advancing again in places, winning further individual battles along the way, capturing further cities and further prisoners in the months and years that followed the winter of 1941. But never again with the same realistic prospect of outright victory that had existed, however briefly, in the campaign's opening weeks that summer, before any of the 5 compounding mistakes had fully revealed themselves to the men who made them. 90 days had been the plan, a number Hitler had stated to his own generals with the same total confidence he brought to nearly every strategic judgment he ever made. A confidence that had, by that point in the war, been rewarded often enough in Poland, in France, and across the opening weeks of Barbarossa itself, that few around him felt positioned to seriously challenge it even when the evidence in front of them plainly suggested they should. The war that plan actually started lasted closer to 1,400 days, and by the time it finally ended, the army that had crossed 3,000 kilometers of border in June of 1941, expecting a swift, decisive victory before the harvest came in, was retreating across the same ground in the opposite direction, out of fuel, out of reserves, and out of time in exactly the way its own planners had once insisted, with total and unshakable confidence, could never possibly happen to an army as powerful as the one they had assembled. If you want more stories about the operations that came closest to changing the outcome of history and still fell short in the end, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you, one carefully verified campaign at a time. See you in the next one.